Hey everyone.
Hello,
Hi.
everyone.
So I still think we have a few more minutes. So let's wait a bit.
Yeah, thank you to those who have already joined. We'll give it, I don't know, 5 more minutes or so for some more to trickle in.
Oh yeah, if anyone has any questions or anything that you want us to talk about, just drop a question in the chat, and we'll try to address it at the end.
Yeah, all questions, comments welcome throughout. We really should get some elevator music or something.
Yeah, we should. We don't really have Trailbits branded music, do we?
Maybe next year.
Yeah, from the Trailbits orchestra.
Yes.
All right, we just hit the hour mark, but I'm seeing a few more people still coming in, so we'll just give it a couple more minutes. Thanks for your patience.
Yeah, we already have 2 good questions.
Nice, I love it. Keep the questions
Yeah.
coming. All right, I think we have a good enough group to get started. Before we dive into the fun stuff, let's say, I just wanted to cover a few kind of housekeeping items. First off, thank you for joining. Welcome to our webinar on building secure end-to-end encrypted systems. We will be recording the session, so you should receive a notification shortly after we conclude today. Yeah, like within 24 hours, you should have kind of a link to the recording. We've already mentioned this already, but to those of you who are kind of just joining now, please don't hesitate to drop questions or comments in the chat. We are going to have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the webinar where we can address those, but we also may kind of answer them live if it's kind of related to the topic we're discussing. And with that, I think we can go ahead and get kicked off. So I first wanted to do a quick round of introductions. So I'm Jim Miller. I'm the engineering director here for the cryptography team at Trail of Bits, and I'm joined by Frederick Dahlgren and Marco Lunga, who are also on the cryptography team with me. And just to set the stage for kind of what motivated us to do this webinar, I think when most people hear about end-to-end encrypted systems, they think about kind of common applications like Signal or WhatsApp or other kind of messaging platforms. But really, especially in 2025, we're starting to see lots of different use cases for end-to-end encryption outside of messaging. Things like end-to-end encrypted video calls or audio calls, cloud storage. If you follow the tech news, you may have seen there was a kind of crazy headline floating around that there is some smart toilet that claims to have end-to-end encryption on some of the sensitive data it collects. I didn't read the details, so I won't be able to answer your questions about it if you have them. But point being, there are lots of different end-to-end encryption systems being built, and the use cases are like pretty wildly different. But despite that, like we tend to see these systems really have to solve like the same set of fundamental problems, and they oftentimes run into similar issues. And so we're hoping to kind of walk through like how you can solve these problems and how you can avoid kind of common pitfalls associated with them. And we want this to be approachable to a wide variety of people. It's okay if you haven't thought about end-to-end encryption systems before. Like I said, please don't hesitate to ask questions. But just something to keep in mind, just try to keep a simple kind of mental model of what these things look like as we get into our discussion. You can just imagine kind of the Signal system where maybe it's Mark as a user, he's trying to communicate with Frederick, another user, and they need to deliver those messages via some untrusted server. So with that, I think we can maybe kick off our discussion by talking a little bit about like what the threat model is like in end-to-end encrypted systems. So like Frederick, could you talk a little bit about what makes the threat model unique for end-to-end encryption systems and why it's different than maybe like typical client server applications?
Yeah, sure. I think that's a great place to start. So the difficulties that we see customers have with implementing end-to-end encryption is not really related to encryption per se. It's more related to the threat model, because the whole reason why you're implementing end-to-end encryption is because you don't trust the server. So the server is an untrusted entity in the system. And I mean, if it wasn't really, you could just be doing TLS between the client and the server. So this is sort of fundamental to the whole area. And with this threat model, you suddenly encounter a lot of problems that you need to solve, right? Because typically you implement most of your business logic on the server, but you can't do that anymore because you can't rely on the server for key distribution. You can't rely on the server for like message synchronization or whatever. So you need to push that down to the client and solve these problems in a different way. So I think that leads to a lot of interesting questions.
Right. Yeah. Well said. And I think that's a great transition to kind of our next section here, which is, what are the common problems that you need to solve in these end-to-end encryption systems, and how do you go about doing that? So you brought up one kind of arguably like the biggest problem that you need to solve in cryptography generally is, key distribution. Like how can you establish trust on different keys? So Mark, can you talk a bit about that problem and how you can solve it for end-to-end encryption systems?
Yeah, so naturally on these systems, users want to have strong guarantees that they are communicating with the right peer. And usually that trust is established through some sort of identity keys, public keys. In distributed systems, the users will upload their keys to a server, which is then tasked with distributing these keys as needed. However, through the lenses of malicious server, we cannot just trust a server to distribute keys honestly. They may send a malicious key and try to impersonate a user. So obviously we have to find good solutions to solve this problem. A solution that has been emerging and has been deployed quite successfully in the past is that of key transparency. basically what key transparency does is that it allows a system to have a publicly auditable log of keys that allows end users to check that the server is actually behaving honestly, that's not sending any malicious keys around, but actually that whatever keys sent is actually the ones that we are expecting. And just having key transparency is nice, but actually for actual deployment that do work, we actually want that key transparency is done automatically. Previous solutions like fingerprinting, for example, didn't exactly work because they required manual intervention by the user, which most people actually didn't do. So we actually need deployments.
I never did, for instance.
Right. So we actually do need
my dirty
deployments that
secret
do
as well.
that automatically, yeah.
Cool, yeah, so just to kind of recap the idea. So you need to figure out a way to make sure the key that the server gives you is actually the right key, is actually the key for the person you want to talk to. There are some solutions that require like you manually verifying this key, which I never do, most people don't ever do. And the kind of better solution is this key transparency approach, which, putting it in simple terms, is you're kind of creating this massive database of all your keys in your system that anyone can kind of go and view. And having this kind of single global database allows you to make sure that, hey, my key is actually valid in there. They didn't replace my key with someone else's key, for instance. Is that more or less an accurate picture of what's happening here?
Yeah, that's very spot on.
Cool. Okay, let's talk a bit about group membership.
Sure. So another problem that you want to solve is obviously you want to communicate in groups larger than just 2 people, right? And typically you want to support dynamic group membership. So you want to have new people join, you want to have people leave. And obviously if someone joins, they shouldn't automatically be able to access previously encrypted messages. And if someone leaves or maybe is even kicked from the group, they shouldn't be able to decrypt future messages. And this sort of corresponds to security notions, forward secrecy and post-compromise security. So forward secrecy basically means that when if someone learns the key at some point in time, they shouldn't be able to decrypt earlier messages. So I always get confused about the directions there, but that's what it means. Post-compromise security is sort of the inverse of that, where the system heals if the key is compromised. So if someone learns the key at some point in time, they shouldn't automatically be able to decrypt future messages. And these 2 properties are provided by a group of protocols called continuous group key agreement protocols. And we can look at a simple example, right? So the double ratchet that Signal used to use, and there you start out by doing this triple Diffie-Hellman, but then you keep doing a key agreement with each new message. So when Alice sends a message to Bob, she sends her part of the key agreement. Bob completes the key agreement when he sends a new message to Alice, and they can update their shared key state. And today, Signal uses sort of the post-quantum version of that called SPQR, but that's sort of the general idea. There's also a different protocol called MLS, which is used by, I think, Cisco WebEx and Google Messages. That's kind of the same thing, but it's sort of geared towards larger groups.
So just kind of recapping here, right? So, when you're trying to support kind of a group conversation in these end-to-end encryption systems, like you can maybe imagine like the naive approach would be to just have kind of a single group key that lets you access the messages, but that has all types of issues with when you have especially dynamic groups. You don't want them to maybe have access to their old messages. And really what you need when you're doing a group kind of membership protocol is forward secrecy and post-compromise security. Those are kind of table stakes for most users these days. And
yeah,
those are more or less, that's kind of a solved problem with these protocols, right? So if you're looking to support this, you should more or less just use these protocols in your system, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. So another challenging problem is what happens if someone like loses their phone? How do you back up old content
Yeah.
when presumably the server is going to have that content and you don't trust the server? So how do you go about solving this problem?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. So basically, either the user loses their device, or they buy the next new shiny iPhone and wants to transfer the secure context onto the new device. And there are a number of ways to solve this. So there's sort of I think a really sort of reasonable approach is to what I think WhatsApp used to do, where you can have one device, like the already enrolled device, display a QR code that you use to establish a shared key, and then you can communicate sort of the secure context via the server in an encrypted manner. So I think that's one way of solving it. I think a more sort of high-tech way of solving it that we've seen a couple of times is you allow the user to back up their key material to HSMs in the service provider's network. So essentially, the service provider sets up HSMs that they themselves cannot access. So they can't peek inside and look at whatever is stored inside. And then users can back up their key material to those HSMs and then recover it using a password or a PIN afterwards if they need to. And since this is done inside HSMs, the HSM can ensure that you only get to try the PIN or the password a set number of times. But this is really difficult to set up in practice in a way that's secure, because obviously it's set up by the service provider, but the service provider is untrusted. So you need to sort of ensure that the clients actually trust this setup to be able to use it. That's difficult.
Right. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to make your system kind of publicly transparent and auditable, on top of already being kind of technically complex with dedicated hardware. I suppose you could mention, like, there is a naive solution where you could just treat all new devices as completely new users and kind of add them to your group chat using like the previous protocol. But crucially, that won't let you recover kind of old messages because of forward secrecy. So this is the way to achieve that. But like Frederick said, it's fairly complex. So I guess we could say maybe tread lightly in this regard.
Yeah, for sure.
Cool. Related problems, message backup. Mark, can you talk a little bit about this?
Sure. So users care about privacy and security, but they also do care about usability. So someone may want to be able to set up a new phone and install WhatsApp and get their previous messages there. But obviously, this comes at odds with the goals of end-to-end encryption. And so one needs to really be careful how you design ways to back up messages, because if you just back them up on some cloud platform, for example, even if they're encrypted at rest, those messages are technically not anymore end-to-end protected. So typically, you would want to design a backup mechanism that's kind of preserves some of those properties of the original protocol. A good example of trying to address that problem is the Labyrinth protocol by Meta, which is built in a way that sort of supports multiple devices, but make sure that the accesses to the messages are sort of guarded over time, so that if you unenroll a device from your account, for example, the access to the message is only limited to that point in time. I would say another sort of related concern about usability has to do also with contact discovery. That is in the case of messaging apps, for example, where, again, I just want to be able to start finding my friends on Signal and messaging them. However, in some contexts, this can come at the cost of privacy. Your sort of social graphs and the people you talk to might be just as valuable as the messages. And there you need to be careful how you design this. And I think for a good inspiration, I would recommend sort of looking at how Signal approached this problem, where they designed the system using advanced cryptography and SGX technology to allow Signal to sort of link users while not having any information about the social graph. And I think that's kind of a very interesting use case of deploying advanced cryptography, technically, specifically path ORM, to enable that feature while still preserving as much of privacy as possible.
Right. This is kind of you can probably sense a recurring theme here with all these problems is like user needs to do something, they need information from the server to do that. In this instance, it's contact information are my contacts on this platform, and it's not very straightforward how to do that without leaking information to the server. And so yeah, like Mark talked about, Signal has an approach to this using SGX and ORAM. If you're not familiar with ORAM, it's a fairly niche cryptography area that it's essentially a protocol that hides your kind of memory accesses. So using the kind of strong guarantees with SGX on top of having a kind of hidden memory accesses, you can have some nice guarantees that the server can't really see much of what's happening within the SES enclave. And like the last, like the backup, obviously this is a little bit more complex than maybe the other solutions, having to kind of procure your own hardware and use some specialized cryptography. So I would also say maybe tread lightly in this regard. So another problem is like abuse reporting, right? So in every messaging platform out there, users expect to have the feature of if someone is harassing them or doing some other type of behavior, they should be able to report it. But it's kind of challenging or not straightforward to solve in this context because the server is not supposed to be able to see any of your messages. So how can they kind of review and verify an abuse report if they can't, read your messages, right? So can we talk about how this problem is solved?
Sure. Yeah. So that is the problem, right? So the server doesn't know what messages you're sending, but you still want to be able to report abusive behavior, and you want to do that in a. So let me start this way instead. What services often start out doing is they allow you just to take a screenshot of the conversation and then just send it to some email address somewhere. But obviously, like anyone can just ask ChatGPT or whatever to generate an image of whatever and send it off as an abusive conversation. So it would be nice to have some kind of cryptographic guarantee that, like, if I report Jim for sending like a picture of his smart toilet, for example, the server has to be sure that Jim actually sent this message. So how this is typically done is using something called message franking. So this has actually been a solved problem for a long time. And the idea here is that when Alice sends a message to Bob, Alice computes sort of a commitment to the message, to the plain text. And then this commitment is signed by the server when it's forwarded to Bob. And then if Bob wants to report Alice, he can just send the plain text and the randomness used to generate this commitment back to the server. And the server can verify the signature and verify that the plain text actually corresponds to the commitment. So this allows the server to sort of verify that the message was actually from Alice. And then obviously if it's up to the service provider to determine if this is abusive behavior or not, but that's not really a cryptographic problem anymore.
That's
even
above
if it's
our
a hard
pay grade,
problem.
you could say.
It's
Yeah.
above our pay grade, yeah, for sure.
Cool. Yeah. So just to recap, like you need some way to have kind of a proof of the, to verify the contents of a report, and you can solve that using cryptography. It's more or less a solved problem with these message franking protocols. Cool. So let's talk about like end-to-end encryption in the web. Like, why is it so much harder to secure end-to-end encryption for web clients than it is for, let's say, mobile clients?
Yeah, so web clients come with a different set of issues. Unlike the native apps that we have on our phones that we get through the App Store, those remain static, and once we install them, they don't change until there's an update. So there's no way for a server to send a backdoor in between. However, for web client, these are inherently dynamic. So a malicious server can sort of send an honest version at some point, but may sort of serve a very different and backdoored version of the web application later, which basically just sort of voids the whole end-to-end encryption guarantees. And a way people have been trying to address this, there's a fairly new proposal that's called Web Application Integrity, Consistency, and Transparency, which is building on things like source integrity and some sort of a transparency systems, as we've talked before, to enable browsers to check that they are receiving the actual expected version of the web application, and also to allow sort of a group of users to make sure that the server is only serving a valid version of the web application as expected. And over time, also users can verify that historically the server hasn't modified the web application in a way that is malicious.
Yeah, so just to kind of recap, like the mobile ecosystem has, it ends up being sort of nice for end-to-end encryption, that there are these centralized app stores that you have to publish your app through, and you can't kind of serve different versions to different people. But that doesn't exist on the web, and so Mark talked about the solution here. It's quite similar to the key transparency solution, where you have this kind of public database that people can kind of audit and detect kind of inconsistencies, things like that. Cool. And then let's move on to our last problem. I think everyone's favorite buzzword these days, post-quantum. What's the deal with post-quantum in the context of end-to-end encryption?
I think everyone's favorite buzzword is AI, but maybe the second most favorite one is quantum and post-quantum.
It's a close second.
Yeah, it's a close second. It's our favorite buzzword, of course.
Exactly.
Yeah, so I think there are two considerations that we need to make if we want to make these systems post-quantum secure. Because quantum computers, whenever they exist, will be able to break classical asymmetric primitives that we use for signing and key agreement. So basically elliptic curve cryptography and RSA and all that good stuff. So if we can forge signatures, obviously that's bad because we can impersonate other users, and this will obviously be a problem as soon as like quantum computers exist, right? But the thing is that if we can recover encryption keys from key agreement, we can store messages now and then decrypt them in the future. So this is something that we need to protect against now. So we need to sort of secure our key agreement protocols to make them post-quantum secure. And so at least Signal and iMessage have implemented solutions for this. So Signal uses something called PQX-DH, which is the post-quantum version of X3DH, the sort of initial Diffie-Hellman handshake. And then for the double ratchet, they replaced this with something called SPQR, which stands for sparse post-quantum ratchet, which is basically the double ratchet. And then you run a sort of post-quantum key agreement ratchet like inside this as well. So you get sort of both the security from the standard ratchet and the post-quantum ratchet at the same time. And for MLS, there's X-Wing, which is sort of also one of these hybrid protocols where you do both a standard Diffie-Hellman and then the post-quantum key agreement as well.
I mean, you got to respect the naming of X-Wing. Always count on cryptographers to come up with the most creative names. But yeah, like the other kind of problems we talked about, there's just more or less a solved problem if you're looking to implement post-quantum. Recommend kind of checking out these protocols. They've been, reviewed, formally verified, all that good stuff. So that kind of concludes our this portion of our webinar where we're kind of going through the common problems and the solutions that kind of best address them. For most of these, like we've been saying, these are more or less solved problems. So we definitely recommend not reinventing the wheel if there is a nice kind of existing solution for you. Mark, Frederick, anything else you want to add about kind of various problems and solutions in context of end-to-end encryption?
No, I think, these are solved problems. I think where you run into issues if you want to implement end-to-end encryption is when you have additional business logic that you need to sort of shoehorn into the end-to-end encrypted setting. And I think that's something that we'll talk a bit about next. So I think that's where maybe some of these solutions won't address the problems that you have.
Right. Yeah, these are kind of the common problems across all use cases, more or less, and then there are going to be some more specific problems that may arise depending on your more specialized use case.
Yeah, for sure.
And that's a great transition to our next topic, which is, so outside of messaging, what are people doing with end-to-end encryption these days?
Yeah, a very good use case for end-to-end encryption lately is cloud storage providers, where in theory they allow users to back up their data securely to the cloud. Another sort of related sort of use case would be password managers. In this case, we're not talking about sort of files, but we're only talking about just about passwords. So, however, what we've seen lately is that the line of research, especially from ETH Zurich, has really shown that many of these cloud storage providers have been deployed in a very insecure manner. For example, they had a look at Mega, where they found out that the server could recover some RSA private key, or it could upload files in a way that was undetected, which was really sort of very bad.
So let me interject there. Like, yeah, there was some fairly severe flaws discovered in these kind of end-to-end and cloud storage protocols. Like, what makes it more challenging to solve end-to-end encryption for this use case? Like, why is like that more or less not solved in the same way that like Signal is in messaging?
Yeah, so I think the core of the issue here is that unlike, let's say, messaging, where there's really only one end-to-end encrypted protocol that is running, in cloud storage, there's inherently sort of several protocols that are running and interacting in ways that can be dangerous. And so you have really to be able to design such a protocol that it has sub-protocol interacting in a way that these interactions are carefully managed and are secure. And also really for cloud storage, there was never sort of formalization of what a secure cloud storage should be, should even look like. Unlike Signal, where we have a Signal protocol that's sort of the state of the art. Luckily, lately there's been a paper by Bakandal et al. That was published at Crypto 2024 that really takes a hard look at cloud storage and provides sort of definition of what a secure cloud storage should be, and also how to implement that securely. I would also say like the very last issue maybe one has to consider for cloud storage and password managers is that we want to allow these services to be used by users who only have low entropy passwords. This means you also have to design them in very different ways. You need to use something like OPRS, for example, to prevent brute forcing and other similar measures.
Passwords are the bane of cryptographers' existence. But cool, yeah. So it's more challenging to solve. There are kind of more considerations ahead, but there has been some kind of recent progress on formalizing these protocols recently, which you should definitely check out. But cool. What are some other use cases we can talk about?
Yeah, I think another interesting use case is voice and video calling. I think that's also a different area where you have sort of business logic interacting with the end-to-end encryption. So we did a review for Discord last year, for example. They'd implemented WebRTC and wanted to provide end-to-end encryption for that communication stream. And sort of what's interesting about that use case is that in WebRTC, you have this dedicated server called a selective forwarding unit, which does transcoding on the fly of frames. But obviously, if you're encrypting all the frames, then it can't do that anymore. So they had to sort of really design this really difficult encryption protocol where they encrypted parts of the frames to be able to allow the SFU to do its work, but still provide security for the end users. So I think that's another interesting use case, I think, where you get that interaction, which creates a lot of difficulty.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And yeah. And another example is that I think we're seeing more and more of our local first applications, where you're sort of moving more and more logic down to the client. And in particular, you're moving sort of synchronization down to the client, and the server basically just functions as as a delivery mechanism. And I think those are really interesting because that means that the server isn't really part of the business logic anymore, and you can build end-to-end encryption on top of that pretty easily. So I think that's a really cool use case that I want to see more of.
That's perfect for everyone's smart toilet that they want to be end-to-end encrypted now, right?
Yeah, definitely. You want your smart toilet not to leak anything sensitive.
Exactly. Great. Okay, so let's move on to our last topic here. So, formal modeling, formal verification of end-to-end encryption systems. I will be honest and say, like, I've always found formal verification to be very powerful and exciting, but every time I see the word, I also get a mini spike of anxiety because I know kind of historically how difficult it can be to try to use these tools and try to like build a complete model of your system. But what I think has been really cool to see is in the context of like protocol modeling, it really seems like these tools have gotten a lot better and especially a lot more user friendly, and you're able to kind of develop some really effective and powerful models, even with only like a small amount of time. Like I think historically you kind of had to rely on more or less an army of grad students working for several months to get kind of useful results. But I think especially for these protocol modeling tools, that's not the case. So, kind of, Mark, could you talk a little bit more about kind of formal modeling and end-to-end encryption systems?
Sure. So as you said, historically, it's been sort of more of a high effort endeavor. However, lately we have had some really nice high impact success stories of formal verification that's really sped up deployment of protocols. A good example that I want to take is Signal's upgrade to post-quantum upgrade. In order to do that, they used a tool called ProVerif, with which they were able to sort of iterate through different versions of the protocol, find attacks, fix them, find attacks and fix them until they were able to find one protocol that they were really happy with. And I think this sort of shows the potential for formal modeling to actually be a great tool when you're designing end-to-end encrypted systems. So in the next slide, for example, you can sort of see how a ProVerif model will look like. It's a sort of very sort of declarative way of specifying your protocol. You can see that you can sort of implement different cryptographic operations like generating a Diffie-Hellman key pair, hashing. You can also model communication on a network that is attacker controlled. You have this sort of in and out syntax. And finally, you can query ProVerif to demand whether is my message that I sent over my protocol secure, and ProVerif will actually find an attack if your protocol is not secure, and actually an attacker would be able to find vulnerability.
Right, and you can see, I know the font's a little bit small, but like the syntax, you know, there's always quirks to different syntaxes, but it's like more or less like pseudocode. It's not that difficult to kind of write a relatively complex protocol in a short amount of time, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I can. Yeah, I would also add about the question on how long it takes. I think we've, in our own work, we've used formal modeling and had really great results in only a couple of weeks. Audit we did for OCAM, for example, that was only a couple of weeks. We're able to verify a large component of their system using something like CryptoVerif. So it's definitely a tool that is usable.
Definitely. So I wanted to mention this tool as well. So something that we've used in a few client projects is a tool called VerifPal. And it's not really a formal modeling tool because it doesn't really have soundness or completeness guarantees. So you're not sure to find all attacks with this tool. And you may also find attacks that are not really valid in your setting. But you can sort of think of it as a protocol design fuzzer, where you can specify your protocol pretty quickly. The syntax is super easy to understand and to sort of write protocols in. And then you just run the tool, and it can help you find the most obvious attacks, and also some attacks that are not so obvious. So this is something that we often recommend, that clients who are not familiar with formal modeling start with, because it allows you to sort of play around with the protocol and figure out what can be vulnerable and how to fix that. I think this is an interesting tool as well that doesn't get so much spotlight.
Right. And to me, like the killer takeaways are like, one, now with these tools, like you're not talking about several months of a timeline, even for complex protocols. Like you can get a quite complex model built and verifying non-trivial properties like in sometimes a matter of a week or less. And the other killer takeaway is the fact that these can kind of operate as like a testing harness for your protocol, right? If you start off with a simple model, and then let's say you want to go and add or solve those problems that we spoke to earlier, well, you can kind of think about what kind of change you need to make to your design. You can model it in your already existing protocol, in your existing model, rerun your proven properties, and you can see if your design changes kind of violated those properties. And both of those are just so important to making these tools like actually practical and useful for real systems and not just like an academic exercise. So with that, we have some links here. Like we like if you're building a system like this, we really encourage you to try out these tools. It can be a little bit daunting at first, but like trust us, they're really a lot easier to use than they historically have like used to be. And in particular, I recommend checking out some of these links we've shared. You can also check out our publications page where we publish our public audit reports, and many of our cryptography reviews have some sections where we've used these tools, and you can see kind of how we use them for real systems. And then lastly, we also included our contact link. If you ever want to reach out to talk more about end-to-end encryption or especially formal modeling, things like that, you know, we're nerds, we're cryptographers, we always love talking about this stuff. So please don't hesitate to reach out. And with that kind of concludes our kind of presentation content for the webinar. And I think we can transition to a little bit of a Q&A session here. So we got some good questions throughout. So Mark and Frederick are both European, so I think I'm gonna punt this EU-centric question over to them. Do one of you guys want to take this one?
Sure, maybe I can start. So yeah, I'm like Mark. I'm based in the EU, and this is something I've been following closely. I think it's a really good question. I also think it's a really difficult question to answer. I think most companies are hoping desperately that they won't need to address this, that this will not actually be passed into law. So chat control, maybe you should give some background on the legislation or the proposed legislation. So the idea is that end-to-end encrypted communication systems need to support some way to do client-side scanning of I think now it's links and images. It used to be all messages to be able to detect CSAB material, for example. And obviously this breaks the trust model of end-to-end encryption completely. And the challenge is to sort of explain this to the politicians in our home countries and in the EU Parliament. But I think to answer your question, I think most companies don't really have a plan to address this, and I think they're just hoping that it won't happen. I know Signal has said that they will leave the EU if it passes, and I'm sure they will. I don't know, Mark. Do you have anything that you want to add to this?
Yeah, I'm not necessarily sure I have much to add, but maybe one aspect is that sort of a couple of years ago, technologically, people have also sort of thought of cryptographic solutions to these issues, where how can you sort of have end-to-end encryption and sort of some sort of control, and this necessarily didn't end up well. So I think there's also sort of care that has to be taken into sort of trying to push cryptographic solution to that problem. And I suppose, yeah, with time will tell.
Yep.
Yeah.
We shall see. But okay, in the interest of time, let's move on to another question. So I believe the same person has another question, which is also quite good. Yeah, this came up when we were talking about key transparency systems. So where are these databases, these logs stored?
I can, yeah, I guess I could get started at least. So it depends a little bit how different providers sort of may implement that differently, but usually sort of the log themselves are sort of provided by the service provider itself. And so they're accessible to a location that they do specify. However, sort of third parties themselves may sort of, whenever they audit the log and sort of publish proofs, they may themselves sort of publish that in other locations, for example, where sort of users can also access them. This may be, I don't know, AWS or something like that. But I think the typical deployment is that the sort of service provider stores the log in a location that they have, and then other sort of entities may publish other type of information like proofs or audits of the logs in another location.
Right. Yeah. I just posted a link to like Signal has a key transparency server that they've open sourced, and it has instructions for like how you can connect to it and download their log. We actually have built an automated tool to scrape their logs and kind of automate some auditing of the transparency server. So that's kind of the common approach is, yeah, like Mark said, the service provider publishes this database where people can access it. Cool. Derek asked a question, I think may have been answered by another comment, but I'll raise it here.
Yeah, I think this is a really good question. And to be honest, I think most users don't really understand the difference between end-to-end encryption and just ordinary encryption. They don't know what a trusted execution environment is, but I'm not sure that is what matters really. I mean, we want to provide the best security possible for all users, and maybe they don't understand the underlying technology, but they still benefit from its use. So I think that's sort of what we're aiming for. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, it's a good point. It's a hard thing to market because it's very technical and very subtle what it actually means.
Yeah, it's hard to, fully speak to all of, especially like the non-technical users. I think we have a good perspective on, people who are familiar with security and cryptography, but it's hard to say for people who just see this as kind of another marketing term. And yeah, what matters is do what we can to protect them. Another good question I'll throw on the screen here.
Yeah, so something, I mean, this is also obviously really difficult. So to start out, I want to say that today most systems are not peer-to-peer directly. So most of the communication goes via the server still. So that is trusted as a delivery service, even though it's not trusted for anything else. So there is some interesting technology. I'm not sure this would actually work in a peer-to-peer setting, but there's a technology known as oblivious HTTP, which sort of essentially means that you do a number of hops through different providers, where you sort of break the link between the sender and the receiver. So this can be used in a number of different settings to provide privacy, and maybe that's something that could be used here as well. So that's something to check out if you're interested in that.
Definitely. So we're a couple minutes over our time, so I just want to be respectful for folks' time. We do have one more question that I think could be a good one to answer, but maybe this will be our last question before we wrap up.
Yes, I think it's a good question about the sort of balance between features and end-to-end encryption. And I think probably during the talk before, we've seen that some of these really come at the odds with the properties of end-to-end encryption. I think what we mentioned, for example, cloud backups, when you're sort of backing up things online, although even if they're encrypted under a key that belongs to a user, it will be very expensive to sort of have to rotate that key, and sort of you end up in a situation where the messaging application has this nice feature of post-compromise security and forward secrecy, but wherever these messages are actually backed up don't actually have any of those properties because it's just too expensive. So yeah, that's a very good point. That yeah, some of these features do come at odds, and there are maybe some costs trade-off to consider. I know for Signal, for example, there's a really good paper by Dodis et al. That sort of considers how would you do, for example, backup in a way that actually preserves some of the original security guarantees, something interesting to look into. But there was also a point about sort of message ranking and deniability. And yes, there also you sort of give up a little bit of that deniability guarantee for the sake of a feature. Yeah, so a lot of different trade-offs to consider.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, great. Well, let's wrap up our session. I just wanted to say thank you all for joining and asking some great set of questions here. Like I mentioned at the top, we will be publishing a recording of this later on today. We'll also make these links available for you so you can check them out. Highly encourage you to try out these formal modeling tools if you haven't before, and hope you appreciated the rest of the content we had, and hope you all have a good rest of your day. Take care. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.